Well, good afternoon to everyone in the United States and in North America. Good evening to those of you who are joining us from Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and a welcome to everyone who has joined this event of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of AICGS. The European Union is our topic today. In my view, it is one of the most important and perhaps least well understood institutions out there. And we are very fortunate today to have with us the German ambassador to the United States, Dr. Emily Haber, who's going to talk about the priorities for Germany's upcoming presidency of the European Union. Germany takes over the presidency on July 1st, will run for 6 months. And so I'm going to give the floor to Ambassador Haber in just a moment. But the first thing I would just like to remind everyone is a bit of a technical or procedural point. This is an interactive session, and we are very thrilled that so many people are joining us live. We will take questions about halfway through. And I would just like to warn you, because we have so many participants, the more succinct and the more focused your question is, the greater the likelihood is that I will select it. So please do that, and we'll be glad to get to questions in the course of our conversation with Ambassador Haber. The presidency of the European Union, and in fact, all international affairs these days, are overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, there's no difference, there's no distinction there. It's affecting the European Union as well. The German cabinet has approved its EU presidency program last week. The chancellor has given a couple of speeches already about Germany's priorities. The most recent one was in the Bundestag last week. She also gave an interview to the Süddeutsche Zeitung just a few days ago. And also Foreign Minister Heiko Maas gave a speech today in which he talked some length about the European Union presidency. So what are Germany's priorities? How will it pursue them? And how do they affect the transatlantic relationship, the relationship between the United States and Europe, and in particular between the United States and Germany? Those are some of the things we're going to get into here today. And I'm really pleased now to give the floor to Ambassador Emily Haber. Ambassador.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for this invitation. It's truly a very important moment for Germany to take on the EU presidency, because when we had started to prepare for the presidency, none of us would have imagined that we would take over at a moment when the entire world is focused on an economic crisis, a pandemic, possibly even a debt crisis. So basically we had to fundamentally change all our plans given the focus that we have inherited. We'll be very much concentrating on economic recovery. We will be negotiating a huge recovery plan along with the multi-annual financial framework that will have to be negotiated over the next months. We'll be focusing on lessons learned of the crisis. How can we prepare for future pandemics? How can we increase preparedness? How do we have to redefine value chains? How can we redefine stockpiling and preparedness and data exchange in health issues? But all other issues will not go away. We witnessed this pandemic and this economic crisis at a moment when we see huge disruptive dynamics such as digitization and climate change. And we'll use our economic focus in order to make progress both in combating climate change and in enhancing technological sovereignty in the digital field. And among the foreign policy issues that would have occupied us in any event, the EU-China summit will loom large even if we had to postpone because of Corona, the summit that had been scheduled for September. There will be an EU-Africa summit as well, and of course Brexit will be yet another issue. This is just a selected array of topics and political priorities that will loom large during our presidency.
Well, Ambassador, I think that gives us a sense of how broad, on the one hand, the plans have had to be, but also how many areas of international foreign policy the European Union is involved in. I'd like to start with China, which you mentioned. I think was the first of the international issues you mentioned, and the postponement of the EU-China summit, which was going to happen in September. Unclear when it will happen. Why is that? Why is that summit important from a German perspective? And maybe let me tip my hand a little bit in asking the question. We've heard that the investment treaty was supposed to be a centerpiece of that summit, but we've also heard that the progress on it has not been satisfactory. That's, I think, what we've heard most recently from EU Commission President von der Leyen. And of course, there is a range of troubling news on a variety of other fronts. The Hong Kong security law, the situation regarding Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and the imprisonment of perhaps upwards of 1 million Muslim Chinese citizens. So how does the EU-China summit fit into that very difficult picture?
Well, it's complex. That's true. And all of the issues that you critically raised are there. They're the backdrop of the meeting. Yes, the Hong Kong issue. Yes, the Uyghurs. Yes, troubling rule of law decisions. All of that is, I can say, part and parcel of the summit, but it is the backdrop, and the EU, as the Commission President has just said a couple of days ago, we're very clear-eyed about these huge problems. We're clear-eyed about the fact that we don't agree on human rights. We don't agree on many principles. We don't agree on values. We're a systemic rival. And there's no looking away from the issues because that's what we stand for. On the other hand, China, while being a strategic competitor and a systemic rival, is also necessary in order to deal with many issues of our time. Yesterday, I read a brilliant interview by Bob Zerlich, and he said there's this narrative out there that cooperation with China has failed, and therefore we should not seek a cooperational approach anymore. The narrative says the narrative. It's basically the argument in favor of decoupling. But he also pointed out that on many areas, China, even now, and even in a time where it's definitely more and worryingly so, self-assertive, is a responsible stakeholder in the IMF, in the World Bank. It is playing a role as a creditor, even though it's not part of the Paris Club. It had been throughout the 70s and not throughout the 70s. Well, in the 70s, it was an offender in missile proliferation, as everyone knows, but had embarked on a course of cooperation later on, as on nuclear non-proliferation, on many issues, actually. China is a difficult partner, but it's not true, entirely true, that cooperation with China has failed. And it's also in place to observe that we need China on many issues simply because China is too big to ignore or too big to isolate. We need to engage China on climate change. We need to engage China on issues such as standards, international standards for AI, etc. We need China in order to define the rules and acquire transparency on why the pandemic has occurred. So whether we like it or not, we cannot only pursue shall we say, a policy that would only punish or reward behavior. We need to engage China as long as we live in a world where international policies cannot be implemented by law enforcement or judges. And that's what we're going to do in the EU-China summit. We're going to try to engage China on many issues where we need it. Is it going to be difficult? Of course it's going to be difficult. You pointed out that the investment treaty, that has been going on for a long time, as well as the negotiations on geographic origins, also difficult issues. But that's just what international politics are. You have complex partners. They don't share your interest. They have different vantage points, and diplomats and politicians are there to somehow figure out where there's a way forward and where there's no way forward.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps there won't be a breakthrough on those issues, but what I hear you saying is that the dialogue is essential to not only to convey European views to China, but also perhaps as a way of coalescing European opinion. Does it also serve that function?
That is indeed hugely important, because given the changing balance of the world, and given the fact that China seems to view the crisis, the pandemic, as an opening for more assertive Chinese policies, it's hugely and overwhelmingly important that Europeans find a common ground and find a common voice in addressing China. When Secretary of State Pompeo was in Brussels, he had agreed with the EU-US dialogue on China. And I believe that in turn is very important, because the more we act hand in glove, pushing back where we need to push back, trying to establish common ground where we need common ground for moving forward, the stronger it will be noted by China, and by the way, also by other actors. The degree of our cohesion and the degree of our like-mindedness in dealing with China will be carefully noted and will define space that China concludes for itself, how far it can go. But this, Jeff, in turn will require something else. All allies do, we come from different experiences, or at least let me say this, experiences, history, size, power, vulnerability, proximity, etc. All of these are factors that define bilateral relationships, even among allies, differently. And finding common ground and shaping an alliance in order to confront an assertive China, a technological and economic superpower, that will depend on our collective capacity to factor in different interests, different histories, different vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Secretary Pompeo's discussions with his EU counterparts, and I think we'll come back to that in just a second. But the first thing I wanted to touch on is, often the questions related to China and the policies of the European Union or of individual EU member states toward China is often placed in kind of juxtaposition to the extremely challenging relations between the United States and China. And so there are those who want to say the United States and China are embarking on something like a new Cold War or some new form of confrontation, and we don't want to be part of it. We stand aside from it. And I thought it was also interesting, in one of her recent speeches, Chancellor Merkel made the point to say that Europe is part of the West and is not neutral. So it seems to me that that's kind of a fundamental issue that relates not only to China, but also to how Europe sees itself vis-a-vis the United States. And I wonder if you could maybe give us some insights into how you expect that discussion and that balancing question to affect Germany's presidency, but more generally its international approach.
It's fair to say, and it's important to say, that when we reflect about values and principles and democratic choices and rule of law and democracy, and actually our collective identity of the West, where do we look towards? We look towards one another. You look to European partners and Canada and Australia and a few others, but mostly Europeans. And as far as we're concerned, we certainly look to the United States because you've defined these principles and values as part of the international landscape, as part of the regulatory framework that became the basis of the international landscape. So if we act together, we'll be able to leverage each other's power. And that is, I find, something that is at times being forgotten. I saw a poll the other day which was worrying. It was a German poll, and the question asked was, do you believe that China is a more important partner than the United States? And whereas last year, 24% of Germans said yes, in this year it was 36%. Now, I think this is completely oblivious of, first, the common ground that we share on principles, values, and democratic identity. It's also oblivious and ignorant of the security paradigm that defines actually that defined in the past and defines today a European capacity to live democracy and rule of law in the face of threats and dangers. But it is reflective of a changing mood in Germany. Now, that for us should mean acting as allies should, factoring in different points of views, different vantage points, with the express objective to find common positions in order to confront what threatens or endangers us.
You mentioned Secretary Pompeo and the apparent agreement between the United States and the EU to convene a high-level dialogue on China. Do you expect that to start soon? What will be the components of that? Can you shed any light on how quickly this will happen and what it will encompass?
No, I can't as yet, but I think it's important that we talk. I see a broad range of views on China, mostly critical ones, but there's still a broad range. And Europeans don't quite know where we're heading to. Is it a partial rollback of globalization in some areas, such the tech sector or medical equipment or pharmaceutics and vaccines? Or is it more? Is it actually leading to decoupling and autarky, which obviously would redefine globalization completely? So as this is the case, I think it is in our shared interest to discuss the ramifications and to discuss the consequences and to discuss the risks and the dangers. So we simply need to find our common positions, but we need to talk. We need to discuss in the world as it is changing, the growing role of China and how the European Union is going to confront it and desirably so along with the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could talk about China for a long time, but I want to make sure we touch on other topics. And one that strikes me is actually one that you didn't mention in your introduction, which is Russia. We are, of course, in a very difficult period in U.S.-Russian relations. Most recently, the news stories about U.S. intelligence that Russia might have been paying off the Taliban to attack US troops in Afghanistan. But even before that story, there was already, we were at quite a low point. And I think it's also fair to say that Germany is at a bit of a low point as well in its relations with Russia. Just a few days ago, there was an announcement with regard to the assassination of an exiled Georgian from Chechnya in the middle of Berlin. And Chancellor Merkel has become increasingly open in talking about the attempts by Russia to destabilize and undermine democratic societies in the West. And yet at the same time, French President Macron has been embarking on an effort to establish or to find areas of cooperation with Russia. So when we talk about Europe speaking with one voice, I wonder what that one voice is in this case. How is Russia going to play a part in, or Russia policy going to play a part in this in the next 6 months?
You pointed out some of the problems we had. The attack, the cyber attack on the Bundestag, the Tiergarten case, which is now handled in court. We've seen Russia a couple of years ago invading territory of another country and annexing it. We've seen its policies in Syria. We've seen its approach in eastern Ukraine. We've seen cyber attacks, and we've seen disinformation campaigns. So that's a pretty tall order. But how can it, when President Macron in the Munich Security Conference spoke about a strategic dialogue, he didn't deny any of this. He said we would have to approach Russia knowing these differences and not offering any ground on principle in these negotiations. Basically, he was making the point, as I believe everyone would in Europe, we need to talk to Russia. They're our neighbor. It's our geography. It's huge. It's often obstructive, negative. Some behavior is malign, and it's unacceptable. But how would we solve these issues by not talking to Russia? Foreign policy and international politics are not only about punishing or rewarding behavior. Sometimes it is. Sanctions can punish behavior, and withdrawing sanctions can reward behavior. But if that were the only vehicle of international politics, well, then we would be able to forget about diplomacy. Some problems need to be solved along with Russia, even if we criticize Russia, even if we call out Russian behavior, as we need to call out Chinese behavior. But we'll be needing Russia on many foreign policy issues, such as on Syria, on the Ukraine. We'll be needing Russia in preserving the international arms control architecture, in extending transparency and checks and balances and stability. There is simply the irrefutable fact that these issues cannot be solved by simply calling out Russia or punishing it. We need space, and that means we'll need both deterrence and dialogue. We will not give any discount on Russian behavior in this dialogue. The Chancellor has been pretty clear in saying that there is a behavior unacceptable, which needs to have a price tag. But it's our neighbor. And you asked about European unity. Yeah, there are different opinions in Europe, and how could there not? The different Eastern European countries have had their experiences of invasion and occupation in the last century. Western European countries come from a different vantage point. Exposure, here too, exposure, vulnerability, history, experiences, traumata, size and power and role, all of that plays a role. But I've heard no European country so far denouncing or taking a step away from the Mogherini principles. So in principle, while there are nuances about policy conclusions, on the principles we stand together. And don't confound European differences which exist in nearly every single foreign policy dossier, because bilateral relations vary. There's not just one template. People often discuss as if there was just one template. That's wrong. But it's the force of the European Union to factor in interests of different actors and interlocutors within the European Union and then come to a conclusion.
Thank you. If I could ask one question before I start to take some of the questions that are now coming in through the Q&A button. A reminder to everyone, use the Q&A button. Don't use the raise hand button because we're not monitoring that during this session. But before we do, one question that's not strictly speaking about the European Union, but we've certainly seen a lot of news reports in recent days, and we've seen comments by President Trump and others about the possibility of drawing down US forces stationed in Germany, perhaps bringing them back to the United States, or perhaps, as he speculated last week, moving some of them to Poland or to other locations. This remains a current topic, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity. How do you see this as German ambassador, and what's the German reaction to this discussion about a possible reduction of about 25 to 30% in the US presence in Germany?
Well, we've not yet been privy to the details of what is going to be suggested. I would say that changes in military postures and presences happen all the time and are normal and legitimate and usually informed by strategic thinking and strategic changes, be it in threat assessments or geopolitics and so forth. Now, when I hear that American forces in Germany protect German security, I think that is not quite what they do. They protect transatlantic security, they deter Russia, they bolster the security of NATO allies, and actually they also project American power far beyond the NATO area. The AFRICOM in Stuttgart is coordinating American forces in, I think, 51 countries, and the High Command in Wiesbaden is coordinating American forces in 56 countries. So you see it's going far beyond that, and it's actually protecting genuine American interests. And as I, as German ambassador, and Germans believe that protecting American security interests are also protecting transatlantic interests, my observation would simply be look at the greater picture and do not reduce the discussion or the conversation about this to an aspect which is but a minor one. Should we fulfill the 2% goal? Of course we should. And I might point out that the Wales commitment tells us that they need to be fulfilled by 2024, and we're in 2020 right now. The Chancellor, in the interviews that you've mentioned just now, has said that Germany is determined to fulfill the commitments.
All right, thank you. And I think as you've mentioned, I mean, it is remarkable in my view. To see German defense spending increasing by over 40% in just a few years, and to see
45%. It's 45%, and may I say, in May we're not below 1%, as I've heard last week, or at just 1%. The figures in May said 1.54%. So in all fairness, American presences can't be there as a award, and withdrawing them can't be part of a punishment. They're there as part of a wider picture serving transatlantic security. And we are proud of having them and hosting them in Germany.
Okay, let me turn to one question from a a viewer. This is a question from John Kornblum, a former U.S. ambassador to Germany and former Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And his question is, the European and American press are making a lot of recent statements and drawing a conclusion that Germany is ready and willing to lead Europe. And John's question is, what is different, and does this mean important changes in Germany's approach to things such as debt sharing, the trade balance, and security policy, which have caused frictions with EU partners?
Well, it's true that some traditional orthodoxies have been jettisoned in the discussion on how to respond to both the pandemic and the economic crisis. John Kornblum has observed that from the German vantage point in Berlin. We don't have Corona bonds, that's true, but for the first time, Germany, along with France, has put forward a proposal that then was reflected in a European Commission proposal, that the European Commission can raise money on the international financial markets and can hand out liquidity both as grants and as credits to the to European countries, which over a long time frame will have to pay back. That is true, but only according to their share of the budget. Is this mutualization of debt? Is that a Hamiltonian moment? Well, it's a one-off, but it reflects a new thinking, and it does so because this crisis is different than all previous crisis. This is not attributable to policies or to economic and fiscal policy decisions. This is due to the fact that every single country in Europe, albeit in different degrees, were hit by a pandemic, and that was really existential in the sense that the imagery of the crisis were the coffins in Bergamo. It brought really home that this was about lives, and it's why, well, at the beginning of the crisis, every country usually reacted in an inward-looking way, trying to take care of their own. We've quickly turned the tables. Germany did, but many other European countries did too, because they saw the relevance of solidarity and the lack of it, the price tag it would carry. So yes, there's something new. It's not a long-term decision to move towards a mutualization of debt. These are not bonds. It happens within the framework of the European treaties, but it was our sense that our debt ratio was so low that Germany could afford to take on new debts, and actually had to, as every single European country now has to do what it can do in order to speed up the recovery. So yeah, it's a paradigm change. It happens within certain confines, if you like, but it's new, and it reflects a much higher degree on European convergence, cohesion, and resilience thinking than we've had in the past.
I have a question here from Andreas Rischke about China, and his question is that the German attitude on China is partly due to the fact that China is predictable, and in the United States, he observes, stakeholders in the United States don't always seem to be on the same page with relation to Europe and China policy. Would you agree with that statement? how do you find a coherent view that that German or European Union policymakers can engage with coming from the United States?
Well, our idea of multilateralism is certainly not convergent with the Chinese idea of multilateralism and the principles and rules and regulations that we like to see in place and respected and implemented. It is also true that the United States has, over the past years, withdrawn from a series of international treaties, agreements, international organizations, not the large ones such as United Nations or IMF or World Bank and so forth, but from a series ranging from UNESCO to Human Rights Council. It also is true that the international global order and the predictability of it, that rules and regulations and institutions promise are now oftentimes viewed as an impediment to the pursuit of American interests. This is a point where it's true that we would think differently, and I would say every single European power thinks differently, because as medium or small-sized countries, we depend on predictability and transparency of a system. We depend on the rules, we depend on agreements, we depend on treaties, we depend on institutions, however flawed they may be, and however much reform might be desirable in every single of their cases. But we depend on them because on our own, or with this, without this landscape of rules and institutions, we would be infinitely weaker and incapable to defend our interests and stand our ground. Perhaps for the United States, which is the single most powerful country in the world, the calculus is a different one, at least in bilateral situations, because it would infer that any bilateral situation would promise asymmetric power. But that's not true for European countries, and that's a point where European countries all agree.
Thanks. I have a question here from Dieter Detke, and he asks if you could comment on the recent decision of the German Constitutional Court, which with respect to the powers of the European Central Bank and the possible room for maneuver for the ECB to stabilize the monetary situation in Europe. Is that an obstacle for necessary action? Is that standing in the way of deeper integration? And how do you see that problem being addressed if in the coming weeks, because there is indeed a deadline which was established in that ruling for some kind of response?
It's important to see that the ruling of the German Constitutional Court did not relate to the present recovery program, or that is the April program of the ECB. It related to an earlier liquidity program of, I think, 2015. So first, it's important to note it doesn't affect the present attempts to cope with the crisis and to manage it. The Constitutional Court has asked the European Court to answer certain questions which related to the proportionality of looking into the economic effects of the liquidity program at the time. It's just about the proportionality. It's about the analysis by the ECB that the measures it had taken at the time were proportional in economic terms. That's where answers need to be have been requested by the by the German Constitutional Court. It's not the first dispute of this kind. It has a longer story, and it is not explicitly not undermining or questioning the prevalence of European law. It's just about the gray zone between national laws and European laws. And as long as the Chancellor said in her interview over the weekend, as long as not all powers from national states are transferred to Brussels, we'll have disputes of this kind.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a couple of questions about climate change and energy policy, and I think it's fair to say that not only for the EU presidency, but in the response to the pandemic and the economic stimulus measures that the German government has passed, there is a large amount of money devoted to climate change issues. And so the questions that we've got, on the one hand, one is asking about Germany remaining committed to fossil fuels, including by increasing its reliance on natural gas. And it won't surprise you, Ambassador, to hear we've had a couple of questions also that relate to Nord Stream 2. And I would ask maybe if you put that in the context of sanctions, which you mentioned earlier, and the potential of stronger sanctions from the United States. But also as a question of the EU context. Of course, there's an EU third energy package. There's an there are EU energy directives, and an energy union. Then, so how does that aspect of climate change policy fit together?
Climate change is going to be one of the key areas and key dossiers for our presidency, and we have, as the European Union has, made clear our determination that we should use the crisis, the economic crisis, in order to address one of the monumental disruptive dynamics of our time, which is climate change. We're going to speed up and accelerate the withdrawal from fossil fuels. We're going to change the incentives in order to reach earlier withdrawal, not only in total by before 2050, but already in a higher degree by 2030. We're going to design and shape the recovery programs in order to incentivize Green Deal behavior. So where does Nord Stream 2 and our, as you said, reliance on gas come in? Well, that's transition. Right now, we need it. And it's a market. I don't deny for a second that this project comes with a history and a legacy and extremely painful experiences which is true, in the last decade, we've seen cases where energy policies have been politicized and weaponized. But it's also true that we have reacted to it, and nowadays you can do no more hostage taking for political reasons by withholding gas. You can pump gas into any direction, north, south, east, west. So in that case, energy security doesn't depend on where the gas comes from. It depends whether you can actually replace a provider. We're seeking more diversity in energy matters, including, by the way, LNG, by building LNG terminals. We want to have options. Energy security means options. We've also addressed other criticism with regard to Nord Stream. I'm really firmly convinced that we wouldn't have seen the trilateral EU Commission, Russian and Ukrainian transit treaty hadn't it been for German politics and the German government to push for such an agreement. We agreed it was necessary because it was a symbol of stability for the Ukraine, which is a major policy objective, foreign policy objective of my country as well. So overall, I would say we've addressed many issues. We have found a compromise in the European Union with regard to the Energy Directive. The relevant authorities have declined to provide Nord Stream with an exception. We found a common ground. And if now sanctions are being considered that would target numerous European countries, by no means only German ones, Dutch, Austrian, French companies, Danish companies, and outside of the European Union, British companies, Norwegian companies, targeting them, well, then the question remains, I don't see how Nord Stream nowadays could be leveraged in a political way. People have feared in earlier times. Where then does it make sense, and how does it make sense to target European allies? And what do you think will the Russian conclusion from that be? I'm sure actually that they're seeing this as a policy gain for themselves, because they see it as a potential transatlantic disagreement.
Thanks. So turning back to the security relationship and the transatlantic partnership, I'm going to put a couple of questions here together. The first one, I noticed in the Chancellor's interview with the Süddeutsche Zeitung last week, she raised the question, and if I'm going to do a quick translation here from German, she said, we grew up in the confidence or in the assurance that the United States wanted to be a global power. And if the United States, for its own, out of its own free will, decides to step away from that role, we're going to need to think very fundamentally about that. So that's one point from the Chancellor. And then there was also in the Foreign Minister's speech, that he gave today, he said that he was talking, he said the European Union must be prepared for the result of the US presidential election. He didn't say exactly how and what way. How should people in the United States take these, what seem like real statements of concern from some of the most senior German politicians, including the Chancellor, concern about the United States and the way it sees its role in the world?
Well, we already talked about multilateralism and that we start to look at multilateral at the multilateral order and its instruments and institutions in somewhat different ways. Not on all of them, but on quite a number of them. And I mentioned the fact that European countries depend on it because they cannot, being in bilateral asymmetric situations would always be a disadvantage for them. So we are convinced multilateralists because actually it's our existential self-interest. Now, on what the Chancellor said, I noted that too. I would direct your attention to the way we dealt with the pandemic. It was the European Union that made the first, convened the first major virtual meeting of over 40 countries and institutions and organizations around the world in order to shape an alliance that was to not only confront the crisis, but also seek common ground and common policies on vaccines, on PSB, on therapeutics and diagnostic and so forth. It's been our past experience that it was always the United States that took the leadership in pushing for solutions to the world. Perhaps not everyone liked it at all times, but it laid a claim to the responsibility of being in the lead. In the COVID crisis, I would observe that many American institutions, including NGOs, tech companies have played a leadership role, but shaping an alliance or a coalition in order to find a shared solution for the world, a global solution. There, I would say the European Union has been in the lead, and I believe when talking about a greater European responsibility and the recognition of responsibility and a growing sense of urgency, this is one of the cases in point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got a few minutes left, and I've got lots and lots of questions. I'm sorry I can't get to them all, but there are three that I'd like to pose to you. The first one is, will Germany take some steps to try to deal with deteriorating democratic standards in some parts of the European Union itself? Will that be part of the agenda?
For the first time, the Commission is going to put forward the report about the rule of law situation in the entirety of the European Union, and there will be country reports. This will happen during our presidency, and therefore the way we deal with it, the way we manage it, will be a precedent and a template for the way it's going to be handled in the future. It's an important issue. The Chancellor in her interview pointed out that different European countries, especially from Eastern Europe, entered the European Union with their share of experiences and their sense of identity and their sense of national interests. So what happens, and perhaps happens as part of a normal development, is it's how shall I? It's like an engine. We're seeing adaptations, some painful, some not compatible with what we think democracy and democratic opposition in European sense of democracy should allow, but it's part of a longer term process coming from engaging different experiences, interests from Eastern European countries. So it will be a major topic, but I believe that you'll have to do that. You'll have to deal with developments that we find difficult to see comporting with what we all want to be. We'll have to handle that in a way that is not more divisive and not in a way where European countries with different experience would feel isolated or excluded. So it's tricky, but the principles are there in place, but the way we deal with it will have to be it will be a pattern, and therefore will have to be handled with an acute sense of history.
Okay. We've already talked about Russia, but I've got a question here which I think may win the award for succinctness. It's a question from Barry Posen. And his question is, what leverage does the EU have to elicit less provocative behavior from Russia?
Well, that's a negative. But we have a number of instruments at our disposal. One has been sanctions. Sanctions, I always say, sanctions are a necessary part of the diplomatic language. They're the toughest form of diplomatic language, but they're only part of the toolbox. They need to be used beside other instruments that you have, and that is dialogue, that is engaging Russia, much as we may find it distasteful in certain circumstances or when Russian behavior is really unacceptable, but it can't mean stopping to talk to Russia. How would that help? So I'd say a mix of dialogue and deterrence, clarity on principle, understanding of the Russian vantage points, which is always a good thing in diplomacy, trying to put yourselves in the shoes of the other. Even if you don't agree with him at all, you need to understand where your interlocutor is coming from, what his perception of his own interests are and why that is the case, and then you sort of can move forward. But it will have to be a mix. Nowadays, people, when they talk about either Russia or China, they often do it in a way as if foreign policy was only about rewarding and punishing. Yeah, I'm not excluding that as part of the sanction toolbox, but it can't be all, because if it is, you simply shrink the diplomatic space you need for engagement of interlocutors necessary for a specific solution, be it international or be it bilateral.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just we saw after the attack on Mr. Skripal in the United Kingdom that the UK orchestrated an international response, which included steps by members of the European Union. Should we be on the lookout for some kind of European-wide or broader international response in the case of the Tiergarten murder?
Well, that's still too early to say because the court will have to rule and the outcome isn't there as yet. So let's wait for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the last question I wanted to get to, we've had a number of people ask about the situation surrounding travel, both travel of Europeans to the United States, which has been interrupted by the pandemic and the international travel restrictions, and also for Americans traveling into the European Union. So I've probably got about 10 questions on that topic, and rather than pick out any one, can you say something about how you see that situation developing? I realize it's not entirely a European Union issue, but it's certainly one that affects, for example, the US regulation applies to people who've been in the Schengen zone. So it's got an EU dimension to it.
Oh, it's got a EU dimension, and actually it's the EU that will decide on how to deal with external borders. Decision will be taken on the basis of the contagion curve, the infection curve. Usually the calculus is, I believe, not more than 50 infections over a period of 7 days per 100,000 capita. So that's the calculus we have in Germany as well. Other aspects will come into play as well, possibly reciprocity, etc. But it will be defined on the grounds of health security.
Mm-hmm. And then in that case, is Germany or will European countries advocate with the United States for a loosening of American restrictions because the infection levels are much lower there than they are here? Is that an active discussion, an ongoing discussion?
We have an ongoing discussion on specific categories of cases where we find a solution is necessary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think today's discussion gives us a flavor for how broad the European Union's remit is. Also, the fact that it is a somewhat malleable thing. As one German expert put it recently, the EU is a consensus machine, and some people may look down on it for that reason, but it's a machine that gives national leaders, cabinet members, and as well as the European Commission an opportunity to work together to find solutions to challenging problems. And so in this next 6-month period, we will, I'm sure, be hearing a lot more about German views of a whole variety of international issues. Germany will be playing a leading role in convening ministers and across the board, and will be playing its usual substantial role on the international political scene. Ambassador Haber, you've given us some great insights today into how that is going to take place, what principles and priorities Germany will set as it does so, and we're really grateful for your spending this hour with us. If I could just give one shameless plug at the end, the AICGS has just released a report which provides some recommendations to the next US administration in some of these same categories: Russia policy, China policy, NATO, as well as a variety of things like trade and even things like workforce development. So we are trying to do our part to contribute to that conversation, and we're really delighted and honored that you joined us today to help bring this to a much broader public.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and wishing everyone out there all the best, and looking forward to seeing you next time. Tomorrow in the morning, we have Minister President Armin Laschet of North Rhine-Westphalia and Governor Phil Murphy, Governor of New Jersey and former American ambassador to Germany, in a digital dialogue which will focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and the lessons that they draw from that experience. So thanks for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.